A war nearly broke out between the US and Britain over a pig. A Soviet officer narrowly prevented World War III after a computer glitch. And in 1600s Istanbul, drinking coffee could get you beheaded. These are strange historical events that sound made up, but are real. In 1859, a war between the US and Britain almost broke out, all thanks to a pig. It started on San Juan Island, a little strip of land between what's now Washington State and Canada. The US and Britain both thought they owned it, because the treaty that set their border was vague about which waterway the boundary followed, so both sides moved in. British settlers working for Hudson's Bay Company and a handful of American farmers trying to claim land. For a while, they awkwardly coexisted, but then one American farmer, Lyman Cutler, found a pig rooting through his potato garden and fired at it. That pig belonged to a British man named Charles Griffin. Griffin demanded $100 in compensation. Cutler offered 10. Well, this little dispute escalated into a full-on military standoff. The Americans sent troops led by Captain George Pickett, who'd later fight at Gettysburg, while the British sent warships with over 2,000 men on board. And for weeks, they just stared at each other, armed to the teeth. Eventually, though, cooler heads prevailed and both governments agreed to share the island until it was officially settled years later. In the end, nobody died, no shots were fired, and the only casualty of what was later referred to as the Pig War was the pig. In the middle of the Cold War, the world almost ended because of a computer glitch. Luckily though, one guy kept his cool. On September 26th of 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was working the night shift at a secret bunker near Moscow. His job was to monitor the early warning satellites that were supposed to detect incoming US nuclear missiles. Just past midnight, alarms went off. The system was screaming that an American missile had been launched, and then 4 more right after it. At the time, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were at their absolute worst. Reagan was calling the USSR the evil empire, the Soviets had just shot down a Korean passenger plane, and both sides were running drills that looked a lot like real attacks. Soviet leadership was very on edge, convinced a first strike was coming any day. The military's official response plan was launch on warning, meaning the second they detected an attack, they'd fire back immediately. But Petrov didn't do that. He didn't think the warning made any sense. A real US strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. He decided to hold off, refusing to report it up the chain until radar confirmation came through, which never did. Turned out sunlight reflecting off clouds had tricked the satellites. If he'd followed protocol, the Soviets might have launched their own nukes in response, and the world would be looking a hell of a lot different right now. In the 1600s Ottoman Empire, drinking coffee could literally get you killed. The ruler at the time, Sultan Murad IV, decided coffee was a political threat. Coffee houses in Istanbul had exploded in popularity, and just like today, these were places where people would sit around for hours talking about business, religion, whatever was bothering them about politics. Murad didn't like that people were gathering like this, sharing what he viewed as possibly dangerous ideas. He already had a reputation for being ruthless. I mean, this was a guy known for executing people over breaking curfew, so when he decided coffee was dangerous, anyone caught drinking it was gonna have problems, and that they would be beheaded on the spot. Yes, some stories even say he'd walk through Istanbul in disguise, sword in hand, personally hunting down coffee drinkers. That is insane. But like any corrupt politician, the hypocrisy was rampant. Murad himself drank coffee in private. Later rulers were a lot more chill about things. First offense, you'd just get a beating. Second offense, well, then you'd be sewn into a leather bag and tossed into the sea. By the 18th century, these bans fizzled out, fortunately, but for a while there, drinking a cup of coffee in Istanbul could literally cost you your life. You would not ever expect there to be any kind of ban on kissing in France, of all places, but back in 1910, they officially banned couples from kissing on train platforms. This was still the early days of train travel when stations were chaotic and too many trains were being delayed because people just wouldn't stop making out and doing these long, drawn-out goodbyes. The law was introduced at stations across France after a few incidents where trains left late because conductors couldn't get couples to stop blocking the doors or tracks. So the government decided to put up signs prohibiting people from kissing. The law technically stayed in place for decades afterwards, but it was rarely enforced. Do you know why the London sewer system is what it is today? It's because back in the Victorian era, the capital of the British Empire became uninhabitable from the stench of its own waste. The summer of 1858 was not fondly remembered by Londoners. It was the summer of what became known as the Great Stink. That year, the River Thames basically turned into a giant open sewer. For years, the city had been dumping human waste, animal remains, and industrial garbage straight into the river. Normally, the flow of water carried most of it away, but that summer was unusually hot for London. Temperatures hit 32 degrees Celsius or over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so everything just started to rot. The smell was unbearable. Parliament, which sat right next to the Thames, had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to cover up the odor. One MP wrote that the, quote, air was so bad it was not only offensive to smell, but dangerous to health. And it was deadly. The same contaminated water had already caused multiple cholera outbreaks, killing tens of thousands of people. The smell finally forced the government to act. A civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette was brought in to design a massive new sewer system, something London had resisted funding for years. In 1932, Australia declared war on emus, and the emus won. After World War I, the government gave land in Western Australia to returning soldiers so they could farm wheat. But then 20,000 emus migrated into the area after breeding season and started destroying everything, tearing up fences, eating crops, basically wiping out their livelihoods. The farmers asked the government for help, and since most of them were veterans, they didn't get scarecrows, they got soldiers. The military sent Major G.P.W. Meredith and his men, armed with 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was to eliminate the emus in just a few days. Instead, it turned into an embarrassing disaster. The birds were too fast, too spread out, somehow way smarter than anyone expected. They moved in small groups, then zigzagged away from the onslaught, and even when cornered, the soldiers' firearms would often jam or they would miss. After weeks of chasing birds across the outback, they'd fired thousands of rounds and killed only a few hundred. The rest just ran off. Reporters started calling it the Great Emu War, and Major Meredith had to admit defeat, saying the emus had the, quote, invulnerability of tanks. One of the weirdest disasters in US history happened in Boston back in 1919. And it involved molasses. A massive storage tank in the North End neighborhood burst, unleashing over 2 million gallons of thick, sticky molasses into the streets. The wave was 25 feet high and moving about 35 miles an hour, fast enough to crush buildings, flip trucks, and knock a streetcar off its tracks. People described hearing this deep roar, like a freight train, before being swept up in the goo. It trapped everything: people, horses, cars. Some victims drowned because the syrup hardened in the cold air before rescuers could reach them. In total, 21 people were killed and around 150 were injured. Turns out the company responsible, Purity Distilling, hadn't even tested the tank properly. It leaked, often so badly that people would come to collect dripping molasses to use at home, and instead of fixing this, the company just painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. After it burst, the cleanup took weeks, and for decades afterward, people swore the area still smelled like molasses on particularly hot days. In 1814, a London brewery accidentally unleashed a flood of beer into the streets. It started at the Moe and Company Brewery, where they made porter, a super popular dark beer at the time. Inside the brewery was this massive wooden vat, 22 feet tall, holding more than 300,000 gallons of beer. One afternoon, a metal band holding the vat slipped loose. Workers didn't panic. Apparently that happened all the time, but an hour later, the whole thing exploded. The pressure from all that beer was so strong, it blew down the brewery's back wall, and the wave of porter, about 15 feet high, tore through the streets. 2 houses were completely destroyed, and the beer flooded people's basements. 8 people were killed, including mourners at a funeral wake who got swept away by this tsunami of beer. Imagine being killed at a funeral. That'd be like getting married at someone else's wedding. In 1976, the Korean Demilitarized Zone became the site of a deadly incident over a tree trimming. 2 U.S. officers, Captain Boniface and First Lieutenant Barrett, were killed by North Korean soldiers while trying to trim a tree that was blocking the line of sight between checkpoints. 3 days later, the United States and South Korea responded with one of the most over-the-top displays of military power in history. But without any casualties. They launched Operation Paul Bunyan, named of course after the legendary lumberjack. Their mission was to remove that goddamn tree and show North Korea just how deadly they could be if they wanted to. The operation was massive. Engineers with chainsaws went to work while hundreds of soldiers surrounded them, fully armed. Overhead, there were 20 helicopters, B-52 bombers flew nearby, and fighter jets from multiple bases patrolled the area. Altogether, over 800 soldiers were involved in this. The North Koreans showed up with about 150 to 200 troops and just watched, clearly taken aback by the massive display of force. In the end, no shots were fired and no one was hurt except for that damn tree. In 1962, a small village in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, experienced one of the weirdest outbreaks in history: uncontrollable laughter. It all started at a girls' boarding school. 3 students suddenly started breaking out into laughter and they couldn't stop. Within days, the entire school was caught up. By the end of the first wave, 95 out of 159 girls were laughing nonstop. Some for hours, some for over 2 weeks. It got so bad the school had to close, and when it reopened, another group of students got hit, and eventually the epidemic spread to nearby villages too, shutting down 14 schools. This was manic, hysterical laughter. It was like Joker's laughing gas. People couldn't breathe properly, there was fainting. Some kids also started developing mysterious rashes. Doctors couldn't find a virus or anything contagious going on. They decided this was a case of stress-induced mass hysteria, or what scientists call mass psychogenic illness. Some people think it happened because Tanganyika had just become independent. Students were under a lot of pressure, home life was super strict, but at school they were being introduced to all these new ideas. Basically, the kids didn't know how to deal with all that stress, so they just laughed, and they couldn't stop. With all that said though, I've been your host James, and I will catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.